Imagine the mastermind generals of a defeated criminal regime, men facing certain conviction for the most heinous atrocities, not only escaping justice, but being hailed as heroes, men of honor, and indispensable strategic geniuses by the very powers that defeated them. This isn't historical fiction. It's the audacious, meticulously planned public relations campaign that followed World War II, a campaign that successfully scrubbed the blood from the hands of the German military and gave birth to one of history's most enduring and dangerous lies. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht. These war criminals transformed themselves from pariahs into prophets for the Cold War West. The evidence against them was irrefutable, their complicity in genocide proven beyond doubt at Nuremberg. So how did they pull off the ultimate disappearing act, burying the facts and rewriting history? Stay tuned as we unmask the generals, the Allied complicity, and the propaganda that kept the world from knowing the full, horrific truth. The German military, the Wehrmacht, stood at its lowest point in late 1945. Germany had capitulated unconditionally. Millions of soldiers were in Allied prison camps, and the leading field marshals and generals awaited trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Yet, within a few years, many of these men, though found guilty, would successfully fight one of history's best public relations campaigns, rehabilitating themselves and their forces. By 1955, they were regarded by Western powers as honorable men and sage advisors in the escalating Cold War with the Soviet Union. The Nuremberg evidence and the general's defense. The Nuremberg trials began on November 20th, 1945, while the International Military Tribunal, IMT, primarily focused on the operational level, those who planned and waged an aggressive war. The complicity of the Wehrmacht in the Holocaust and other Nazi crimes was unequivocally proven. The military defendants included Chief of the Wehrmacht High Command, OKW, Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Operations Staff of the OKW, Alfred Jodl, Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, and Commanders-in-Chief of the Navy, Erich Raeder and Karl Dönitz. The army, whose command Hitler had taken in 1941, was not represented by its own commander-in-chief, but its operational culpability was central. The prosecution presented copious evidence detailing the Wehrmacht's responsibility for genocide and murder on the ground, particularly on the Eastern Front. Chief Prosecutor Telford Taylor laid out the case, stating that the activities of the German armed forces against partisans and other elements of the population became a vehicle for carrying out Nazi political and racial policy and a vehicle for the massacre of Jews and numerous segments of the Slav population. Evidence included written orders, such as the Commissar Order, signed by Keitel, which authorized the execution of Soviet political officers, and Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitz's so-called Severity Order, which declared the destruction of the Jewish Bolshevik system and the extermination of the Asiatic influence in European civilization as the primary campaign objective. Testimony from senior SS figures confirmed active Wehrmacht involvement. Walter Schellenberg, former deputy to Reinhard Heydrich, confirmed a March 1941 agreement for cooperation between the armed forces and the Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads. SS anti-partisan chief Erich von dem Bach-Selewski testified that army group and district commanders were fully aware of the true purpose of anti-partisan operations, which he stated was a pretext for destroying the Slav and Jewish population. He insisted that this cooperation was willing and enthusiastic. Perhaps the most damning testimony came from Otto Ohlendorf, head of Einsatzgruppe D, whose forces murdered around 90,000 people. Ohlendorf testified that the Army Command requested the Einsatz commandos in its area to hasten the liquidations because famine was threatening, and there was a great housing shortage. This evidence implicated figures like Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, who later claimed to have been shocked by the murders, but whose records showed he was well aware of events and even requested wristwatches taken from murder victims for his troops. Further support for the prosecution's case came from Army generals like Johannes Blaskowitz and Field Marshal Werner von Blomberg, who signed affidavits declaring that virtually all general staff officers supported Hitler's war policies. The generals seized the narrative, the historical historian's project. Even as their actions were being exposed at Nuremberg, other German generals began a concerted campaign to absolve the military of its sins. Central to this effort were Franz Halder, former Chief of Staff of the Army High Command, and Erich von Manstein, former commander of Army Group South. While in British custody, they produced a document titled The German Army from 1920 to 1945, which falsely claimed that the army fought a conventional war completely separate from Hitler's ideological crusade. The impetus for this document came in part from the Americans, specifically William Donovan, head of the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, soon to become the CIA, who believed the German generals and the German nation would be necessary allies in the impending war against the Soviet Union. The Americans provided the perfect platform when they released Halder and assigned him to manage the Operational History German Section, OHGS, of the United States Army Historical Division in 1947. The section aimed to utilize the operational knowledge of several hundred captured German officers. Halder was chosen based on the naive but persistent belief that he had been an ardent opponent of Hitler. Halder oversaw the project like a military operation, ensuring that the contributors, including men like Heinz Guderian, Albert Kesselring, Georg von Küchler, and Adolf Heusinger, were aligned with his ideals. Their goal was to defend the honor of the German army and pursue an anti-communist agenda, explicitly agreeing that no one is to be incriminated in any way when it comes to war crimes or crimes against humanity. The result was the production of some 2,500 major manuscripts written by over 700 former German officers. Halder's work formed the basis of the clean Wehrmacht myth, portraying the army as honorable, traditional, and a victim of Hitler's criminal policies. The narrative was simple. The army was mostly unaware of the full extent of the crimes. Where possible, they tried to stop them. The SS was responsible for the atrocities, and the Wehrmacht would have won the war if Hitler hadn't been an incompetent meddler. Continuing convictions and the Cold War pivot. This narrative took hold even as the Wehrmacht's guilt was proven repeatedly at post-Nuremberg trials. Between 1947 and 1948, the U.S. ran 12 trials in its occupation zone. The 7th and 12th of these trials, the hostages trial and the High Command trial, dealt with Wehrmacht generals. In total, 21 men were found guilty of war crimes, including the execution of civilians, deportation to the Nazi camp system, and the murder of POWs. Convicted men included Wilhelm List, Lothar Rendulic, Helmut Felmy, Walter von Leip, Georg von Küchler, Hermann Hoth, and Otto Wöhler. Also convicted was Hermann Reinecke, head of the General Office of the Armed Forces, who was responsible for the deaths of approximately 3.3 million Soviet prisoners of war. According to Reinecke, Soviet troops had lost all claim to treatment as an honorable opponent in accordance with the Geneva Convention by September 1941. Astonishingly, convicted war criminals like Kesselring, Küchler, and Rendulic continued working on Halder's history project for the U.S. Army while serving their decade or lifelong sentences. The rapidly changing international context provided the ultimate escape route for these men as the rift between East and West deepened, culminating in the 1948 Soviet blockade of West Berlin and the launch of the Marshall Plan. The Western Allied powers began to view former Wehrmacht generals not as defeated enemies, but as essential allies against the new Soviet foe. The Manstein trial and the clamor for clemency, the trial of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein in British-occupied Hamburg in May 1949, became a focal point. Accused of war crimes committed while commanding Army Group South, including complicity in mass shootings of Jews and coordination with the Einsatzgruppen, British society was already split. Many political and military leaders believed that Western interests were best served by stopping the prosecutions and building a strong relationship with Germany. Manstein's defense, funded by a large public collection that included a donation from Winston Churchill, was led by 2 Labour MPs. They argued that Manstein could not disobey the illegal Commissar order and that he had been unaware of the true mission of the Einsatzgruppen. Manstein claimed he had received no reports of Jews being shot. In his summation, his counsel declared that Manstein is a hero of his people and will remain one. Manstein was found guilty and sentenced to 8 years in prison in December 1949. But he found significant sympathy in Britain. Journalist and military historian Basil Liddell Hart lobbied the press, and even pacifist Bertrand Russell joined the cause, arguing that the trial was inappropriate given the political situation, the unpunished Allied war crimes, and Europe's need to cooperate with Germany to oppose the Soviet Union. The price of rearmament and the general's release. With the birth of the Federal Republic of Germany in May 1949, the new West German state became a powerful advocate for clemency. Chancellor Konrad Adenauer, the Catholic Church, veterans groups, and the press campaigned to absolve the sins of the Wehrmacht and the German people. In 1950, discussions began about re-establishing a German army to confront communism, thoughts that became urgent after the start of the Korean War. Former Wehrmacht officers, including Adolf Heusinger and Hans Speidel, demanded that the Western Allies must stop the defamation of the Wehrmacht and release convicted war criminals as a condition for their participation. Supreme Allied Commander of Europe, Dwight Eisenhower, obliged in January 1951, stating there was a real difference between the German soldiers and Hitler and his criminal group, a reversal of his wartime opinion. Adenauer soon followed, proclaiming that while certain soldiers were guilty, the vast majority had returned home from war with their honor intact. The message was clear. If the West wanted a rearmed Germany on its side, the Wehrmacht prisoners had to be freed. The British and Americans began doing so in the early 1950s. Helmuth Felmy and Otto Wöhler were released in 1951. Albert Kesselring was released in 1951. October 1952, with a cancer diagnosis providing the convenient excuse. Erich von Manstein left prison in May 1953. Georg von Kuchler, Hermann Hott, and Hermann Reinecke were released in 1954. By the late 1950s, most Wehrmacht prisoners had been freed. The legacy of the Lie Free to Write and network, the generals cemented their myth. Heinz Guderian's memoir, Panzer Leader and Manstein's Lost Victories, repeated the clean Wehrmacht narrative, portraying Manstein as a genius, Hitler as a fool, and the Wehrmacht as brilliant and innocent. Manstein even assisted with planning the formation of the new German military, the Bundeswehr. Manstein once again repeated the lie that he was never notified about the killing of Jews on the Eastern Front. British writers like Basil Liddell Hart published edited collections of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's papers, starting the Rommel myth of a field marshal who fought a war without hate in North Africa. While Rommel may not have endorsed extermination policies, his campaign allowed the Nazis to implement anti-Semitic policy in occupied areas, and his Africa Corps had an Einsatz commando attached. Lower down the chain, officers and soldiers produced endless memoirs, and sympathetic authors in the West echoed the tone in novels and comics. Even SS officers and soldiers soon joined the act, portraying themselves as an honorable pan-European army, distinct from the Einsatzgruppen and the death camp troopers. This sanitized image of the Wehrmacht persisted in Western academia until the 1970s. The essential turning point for the German public was the Wehrmacht exhibition of 1995. This traveling exhibition, organized by the Hamburg Institute for Social Research, showed graphic photos of the Wehrmacht committing or abetting war crimes, launching a national debate. The public release of over 1 million cables sent between the SS and Wehrmacht in the East, decrypted by the British during the war, further proved Wehrmacht complicity. Despite the irrefutable evidence, the image of honorable geniuses like Guderian, Manstein, and Hoth persists in popular perception, often peddled by those looking for a simple story of flawed German heroes versus barbarian communist hordes, or by those with sinister political motive. The truth is that the Wehrmacht were key enablers who enthusiastically launched and fought Nazi Germany's genocidal war. Without their active support, the murder of 17 million people would have been impossible. While the vast majority of Wehrmacht soldiers were not direct murderers, the armed forces they were part of was forged in hatred, drilled for subjugation, and soaked in the blood of millions of men, women, children, and infants. Never forget,